I'd like to tell the story that's been an important part of our family since my dad was a baby. We thought it'd be appropriate to tell the story during my dad's funeral mass as it relates to his namesake and lifelong favorite saint, St. Francis of Assisi. Many of you may not realize that my father's first name was actually Carl. When my grandparents, Fernando and Giuseppina, decided to choose a middle name for their fifth child, they looked to see which saint's feast day was on the date my dad was born, October 4th. They saw that it was the feast day of St. Francis and went with it. His name was then Carl Francis Fernandez, but he was known as Baby Carl. It's very important to learn a little bit about the family history before this point. About a decade prior, in the mid-1920s, about a year after my grandparents were married, my grandmother gave birth to a baby girl named Esmeralda, who unfortunately was stillborn. A couple of years after, they had their second child, Anthony, who was born very healthy. Things were going well until Anthony was about 18 to 20 months old when he developed an illness related to the lungs. We aren't sure of the actual illness, but it could have been pneumonia or possibly complications of the croup. We know that he was in bed at the house, and the doctor came to the house and told my grandparents that he would not live very long. He did end up passing away at the house. You can imagine after having a stillborn child and then losing a toddler, it must have been very traumatic for them and something we cannot possibly imagine. But God turned things around for my grandparents. A couple of years later, they had a girl named Jeanette, which is actually my middle name. And then a couple of years after that, my Uncle Joe arrived. Then they had their boy and their girl, who were very healthy. And then 4 years later, baby Carl arrived. When my father was a toddler, around 18 months old, my grandmother was pushing him in a stroller on the sidewalk in downtown Yonkers, New York. While she was pushing him, she saw a bearded man wearing a brown robe typical of Franciscan monks. It would not be unusual to see people of various religious orders walking down the street in Yonkers in 1936. It was a highly Catholic community filled with people from Italian, Portuguese, Polish, and Irish heritage. However, she made eye contact with this man and felt like she was looking at someone very important, almost as if she was looking at St. Francis himself. And she said this man made very specific eye contact with her. A few days after this strange encounter with the bearded monk, Carl came down with the croup. Today, the baby gets the croup. There is that barking cough like a seal, but doctors can now prescribe medication, and most kids recover quickly. Back then, there wasn't much doctors could do if it hit a child really hard. Carl became very ill quickly, had trouble breathing, and also developed a high fever, and then lay in a coma state and could not be roused. As if history was repeating itself with a child suffering from a lung problem, my grandparents made an urgent call to the doctor to come to the house immediately. The doctor came and said that Carl was in terrible shape, but if he made it through the night, he would be fine. So my grandmother and grandfather kept vigil by Carl's bed with other family members, and my grandmother called upon St. Francis of Assisi and prayed to him, saying, "Please pray for my child. Please pray that Carl lives." I saw a Franciscan monk the other day and I thought of you. If you help save my child, I will change his name to Francis. Well, as you could probably figure out, my father eventually made it through the night. The next day he looked much better, his coughing had reduced, his breathing had improved, and his fever had gone down. Thankfully, history did not repeat that night, and this child survived this time. As soon as my grandmother could, apparently, she went down to the Vital Records office and requested that his birth certificate be changed from Carl Francis to Francis Carl. She didn't just want to call him by his middle name, she wanted it to be official, that her child's records show that he is now Francis. Several years ago, I needed my dad's birth certificate for some genealogy I was doing. And lo and behold, I saw a copy of that original that had the handwritten scratch marks over his prior name and the new names written above. You might know that St. Francis of Assisi is the patron saint of animals. He considered them to be his brothers and sisters. Now, interestingly enough, my father was always sensitive towards animals. It seems that for most of his life, he always had a dog by his side and made a big deal about other people's dogs, too. I also saw him on more than one occasion shed a couple tears, even when he saw a dead squirrel or a failing bird in our yard. I truly feel like he took on one of the qualities of his namesake. My niece Francesca is named after my father, and my son Danny chose St. Francis of Assisi as his confirmation saint. Both of these facts made my father very happy. I went to Assisi, Italy, with my family many years ago. I truly felt at peace in that beautiful town. As I stood in front of St. Francis's ossuary containing his 800-year-old remains, I thanked him silently for what I believe was his help in saving my dad. We sang the prayer of St. Francis a few minutes ago. My dad didn't often sing his favorite hymns loudly in church, and some hymns not at all. But he did belt out that song, and loudly too. I think we can now all understand why. Riposa in pace, Papa. Rest in peace, Dad.